My name's David, and I'm going to be talking to you today about DBA teams that need to transition into DBRE team, but not just about that, also the cultural changes that come with being DBRE. Uh, Wanted to give you a little background on this and myself. So I am a principal DBRE architect that specializes in databases, cybersecurity, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I work for a company called Mock that does a lot of digital transformation, so getting people into the cloud. But before then, I worked for Percona. In fact, headed up all the Mongo stuff that they did for a good while, and I've run for database as a service teams where I did a lot with DBRE stuff. So I just wanted to let you know that's kind of where my background is. If I gravitate towards talking about Oracle or Mongo or anything that you're not familiar with, I pull from a lot of different technologies. So what I wanted to talk to you all about today specifically was about structuring your teams and the changes that you would need to make when going from a DBA team to a DBRE team, then the culture and how you sell that to the rest of the business, you get buy-in, how y'all participate in conversations to really make the most out of the DBRE things. And that's going to be things like, how do we actually get stuff done? How do we work in this new world? What our focus on the team should be, what goals they should have, stuff like that I wanted to cover. But then another thing that I wanted to cover that a lot of people get stuck on is in a more classic DBA mantra, there was a bit of a walled garden that we would do where we didn't want to have a situation where anybody could run reports and get whatever data they wanted. In the DBRE landscape, we do want to get people more access, and I'm going to go in and talk about how we do that for metric data, but maybe not privacy data, and how you can draw some lines there. And then finally, I want to talk about phases of adoption of DBRE, because I think it's really important that you don't try to do everything in the beginning, and you think about a few different design patterns with DBRE teams and how they work with the larger business, and just when it's an appropriate time to use which of those patterns. Okay, so getting into the structure, the best advice I can give any of you on this is if somebody comes to you and says, we're now a DBRE team, or hey, I want you to help us convert our team to a DBRE team, don't throw away what you have. What you have is working. Let's figure out how we make that work better for you, how that fits into an SRE, a DevOps, a DBRE landscape. That's the first thing I would say. But at the same time, as you see on the screen here, if you currently have DBAs and senior DBAs and a database manager type thing, don't just go to, oh, well, now I have a DBRE, a senior DBRE, a SME, and an architect. It doesn't work when you try to just jump there from the beginning. You can add these additional layers later, but I'm also going to talk about SMEs here in a couple more minutes too, because I think it's important to talk about SMEs. And what I would say to you is, if you're going to build out a team, depending on the size of the team, obviously maybe you would do all four of these. But I would probably skip an SME when you first launch your team. And what I've done with several teams that I've built is I have actually gone in and I made it to where there were no SMEs. Everybody was even, everybody was flat when that DBRE team got created. And then based on who took initiative in the tooling area or in Oracle or in Mongo or whatever your techs are, those became the SMEs for those topics. But you'll find that the biggest thing with SMEs is you need to make sure that you don't have John is the DBRE SME. That you never want to do that. What you want to say is John is the DBRE SME for MySQL. Mary is the one for Oracle. And one person might be an SME for, say, Oracle, and they are a junior for Mongo, and that's okay. Just because somebody's an SME doesn't mean they have to know all things and be all things. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of teams make when they try to move to DBRE, they try to create senior roles, or they try to create SMEs and leads. Don't make it about what that one person does from a leveling perspective. Treat it as, what do they know about doing the task they need to do, and create more of a matrix organization. It'll work better for you. By far, it will work better for you. So I wanted to talk about these roles a little bit and how I try to structure my teams, and why I do this. So the first thing is, anybody coming into my team is a DBRE. They are not a senior DBRE. They are not an SME, like I said. And a DBRE is not on call. A plain DBRE is not on call. This should be kind of a staging group. So think about it as it's a mix between maybe new college grads or entry type DBREs that are joining your team, or just people that are just onboarding in their probation period. That's the type of people that should be here. So they should be learning about things. They should be learning how to do things. But I don't think that what you want to do in this level is leave somebody there. And that's why I said here, 20% of the team should probably be in this DBRE spectrum. And they're just the core person that hasn't specialized in an area of DBRE yet. Then you have a senior DBRE, is what I call it, but it's the level 1 on-call. So these are the people that are actually going to take on-call calls for whatever technology in the DBRE team they're on call for. I wanted to say here, your mileage might vary on how you do these on-calls and what a senior DBRE versus an SME does. But the way it works to me is, you have an SME, and I'll talk about that in a second. So think about that as kind of the more experienced, or the leader of a small group. Then you have senior DBREs, and these guys are going to be the supporting people. If that SME is sick, they are going to know enough about it and how to step up. If that SME gets promoted into an architecture role, one of the senior DBREs will naturally flow upward, because they were the backup for when that person was on vacation anyway. And then you have SMEs. And so similar to the senior DBREs, they know everything about a specific tech. We'll use MySQL for this example. Unlike the senior DBREs, even if I have 5,000 MySQL servers, I should only have one MySQL SME, and then I should have several senior DBREs supporting them. And this is so you don't get into conflicts where you have so many servers and one person is doing this and this other person's doing that, and there's not a centralized view making sure everything stays cohesive. Because one of the most important things about DBRE is that reliability part. And so bake that into sort of assumptions you have with your teams. And then finally, the architect is your level 3 on-call. Some companies might call it a level 4 on-call, but basically it's your final escalation path. This is the person that, instead of looking at it from the MySQL lens, they're looking at all of the tooling and all of the technologies, and how are we going to actually make sure that what makes sense on how we're doing backups for MySQL has a similar pattern for MS SQL, for Mongo, so that if somebody needed to jump in and help on a technology they're not familiar with, your tooling, your standards, your processes are somewhat familiar. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. Every technology is different, is unique, but it should be similar. Like, I should be able to say that all database backups are incremental every 4 hours, full backups once a day. And I should be able to apply that to whatever database tech I have. It shouldn't matter what it is. But that's something I would expect an architect would be setting forth. Or an architect might be saying, in AWS, I don't want any of my databases to have routable IPs. I want to use endpoint services so that apps can get to them. And an architect would be setting that across everything. SMEs would be delivering that design into their individual technology area, and senior DBREs would be helping execute that SME's plan to do that. So that's kind of how that breaks down. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. But I wanted to take a time here and say, I called out a very hierarchical order where you have DBRE to senior DBRE to SME to architect. You do, and there are reasons for that. There's reasons why you would only want to have one SME or one architect type role. But there's not a dictatorship. Everybody should be bringing the conversations, should be having ideas, you should be supporting them. Even if it's somebody that graduated college 2 weeks ago, they just started and they go, why are you doing X? They might have a really good idea. And one of the things that I've spent a lot of time with my teams doing is teaching them that it doesn't matter how long they've been a DBA. It doesn't matter how long somebody's not been a DBA. All questions, all ideas are valuable until you actually investigate it and figure out what was tenable, what was not tenable. Because one of the things that I noticed the most in this transformation is you will run across DBAs that have been doing their technology for a very long time and they've done it a certain way. And you might have a tooling specialty, other DBRE that's just joined the team. And they know a lot about Terraform, Ansible, things like that. And there's going to be a collision that you're going to have to deal with on, I've done the same thing the same way for the last 10 years and it's worked, and we need to move this into a more modern way that we can control things in a much more proactive way. So that got me into the team culture and the rebranding, which is, it's not enough just to say, hey, DBA team, you're now a DBRE team. Because that kind of whitewashing or veneer doesn't actually help you, doesn't work for you. What you want to do is you want to put a few new cultural ideas into place for everybody. You might have them in your DBA team, you might not. So one of the first ones was what I was just talking about. Everybody should be contributing ideas. Anybody can be a sponsor for an idea. It's not like you have to go ask the architect or ask the SME, is it okay for me to pitch this in the next team meeting? Everybody should feel that they're expected and supported in communicating. And that all ideas have merit. It's just a matter of finding out how practical they are. Because there's a lot of times, as an architect, I might have to say, no, we can't do that. But I'm not saying, no, we're never going to do that. I'm saying right now, based on what we need to build, or what other dependencies that thing might have, I can't do that in Q2. But maybe in Q4, it is something that can be brought up. And so I think it's important that when you do say that something can't be done, you set a timeline on either when it can't be done or when you're going to look at it again, when you're going to re-examine things. And then finally, and this is the big one, and this last team culture thing is probably the thing that will help you the most when working with development teams. And that is remove the word no from the vocabulary. Too often, what happens is some business user wants to do some terrible thing to your database or get some report, and our first instinct is to say, no, you can't do that. What we need to be doing is explaining how difficult it is or why it wouldn't make sense or the 15 things that we need to do to get there. And that's probably 40% of rebranding comes down to that, where the DBA team becomes a DBRE team and is no longer known for saying no to everything. They're known for being an enabler to find a way to solve the problem. But in truth, behind the scenes, yes, we're still saying no, you can't copy GDPR or PII data into some unsafe place. One thing that I wanted to say is get the culture down. Get everybody on board with those cultural things that I was just talking about before you go outside of your team and start trying to sell the fact that you're now DBRE. Otherwise, it's just a veneer, like I said earlier. It's DBRE in name, not in substance, and you're really not going to get a lot from it. When you also go out and you are rebranding the team, this is selling the idea of it and what you're now going to do and how you're going to do things better or differently. Pick a couple thematic areas and do a roadshow with the rest of your organization, the rest of your business, and talk about those things. Now, like I said here, it could be, our user access policy. So how does somebody that needs access to, how does somebody on the data science team that needs access to production real user data need to go about getting that access? What are the rules on how often they can access that data or for how long? All that kind of stuff. Maybe that's some of the first things that you do when you're road showing the DBRE team. Or maybe the DBRE team's focus was on automating the build process and speeding up the path to production and stuff like that. And in that case, you might be doing AMIs and DB build type roadshow for people. Monitoring access for everyone is kind of something that I alluded to earlier, and this is where we'll talk more in the metric stuff, but the idea behind it is everybody in your company, whether they're a sysadmin or a developer or a DBRE, should be able to go in and they should be able to look at a basic metric like, what is the CPU at midnight last night on a database box? Because what we need to do is we need to provide those tools and accesses to the SRE or the DevOps on call. So if they have a problem with this web app, they can easily see, did the database have a correlative problem? Did it come from the app first? Did it come from the database first? What is the relationship going on there? Data access is a big one. It's a huge topic every time. I make that one of the big things that when I do roadshows, I explain to people is how to get that access, but more importantly, why a DBRE team or other governance team, however you do it in your organization, has to say no to these requests. Not because, Bob in the DBRE team doesn't want to give this person access. It's because it's unsafe to do so, and it's a risk to the company, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the last one is it shouldn't need to be said, but it does need to be said, and that is, don't tell people what you're going to do. Tell people what you have done with the team. You can talk to people about the future state of the team. Yes, absolutely. But the more that you tell somebody what you're going to be doing, the more time a priority might shift you, and then you don't hit that promise that you made to somebody in their brain. And now the DBRE team isn't helping people. Uh-huh.
Fundamentally, what is it that you see differently in DBA? So we used to have DBA, we used to have DevOps, and now the two
No, DBRE, your DBA team becomes your DBRE team. You would no longer keep a DBA team as a separate entity in most cases. What you might have is you might have development DBAs that are part of the development organization to build schemas and queries and stuff like that and optimized SQL. And so you might break the DBA team, depending on your organization and what the teams are doing, into more infrastructure-based DBREs and SQL code-based DBAs. Or, like in my team's organization that I have right now, what we do is we are still, the DBRE team still do the SQL performance stuff, but what we do, and I'll talk about this towards the later the thing when I'm talking about the maturity life cycles, we put somebody from the DBRE team supporting a project. And so we have somebody that's assigned to that project. We help them improve their schema. We help them improve their SQL code. And so we still do that function, but the main function of DBRE is the stability of the system, is the consistency of the system, so that we don't have 15 database hosts that are built 15 different ways because they're either built at different times or 15 different people built them. The focus for DBRE is to get rid of that stuff, but to that point, there's some different design decisions that as an organization you will need to make on, do we put development DBAs into the development organization, or does the development organization borrow a resource from the DBRE team when they need to do those things? So that kind of gets us into the ways of working. And so it's really changing how you do work. And we kind of talked about this a little bit with what you were just asking about, and that is some things that you kind of have to wrap your head around and change is how many of you have SQL files sitting on your desktop because you wrote some code and needed to run it on a database, and you didn't share it with the rest of your team, or you wrote a bash script that you load up into a terminal when you need it. Nobody else has it. We all have this kind of thing, and when you go into a DBRE team, at least the DBRE teams I've created, you might create different rules on this. I make sure that everything is in Git. Now, there's things that you do where you build passwords to be automatically generated in, say, AWS or some sort of password vault, and the password was stored there. Your Git scripts just reference where to go to find that password in said vault. The password itself is not in Git. But if it's not in Git, the code doesn't exist. And this is a really hard thing to do with a lot of teams. It is extremely painful, especially with DBAs, because as DBAs, we have built up a library of scripts that we keep in a folder on our machine that we know exactly where it is and we know what it does, and it's just our catalog of things that we've learned throughout the years. And I'm not saying that you get rid of that folder. What I'm saying is, as part of the team, as part of the ways of working, figure out how you start putting that into Git, you start making it shareable, you start making it iteratable, so the whole team benefits from those lessons learned. And then part of the DBRE teams working with application teams or DevOps teams is also a lot of mentorship when it comes to a database. These people, they don't understand databases. They're not specialists in the database area like you or your team would be. And so what we want to do there is ask good questions, like the number of times that I will be talking to a developer and they'll tell me, it's stupid that this query doesn't perform well. I just asked for X. And so like what I put here in this example is I always ask the question, well, if these were objects, if what's in the database were objects in Java, how would you ask Java to give you those objects? Because when you make them think about it in that way, they're going to realize what they ask the database to do is actually a lot harder or more complicated of a question than they think it is. Or it needs to churn through a lot more data than they think it is, because they get 3 columns back and 100 rows. But you just scanned 200 gigabytes of data and did a Cartesian product. But because a lot of people don't understand the black magic, and I try to let people understand, look, a database is a piece of software. If you're a developer, let's talk about how this software works. You should be able to get where we're coming from. The other kind of way of working thing that I do, I spend a lot of time with is whatever your ticketing platform is. It could be ServiceNow, it could be Zendesk, it could be Jira. I use Jira a lot. If there's an ask to the DBRE team on an email, on a chat, on a phone call, doesn't exist. You have to work with the team, and as much as they want to help people and they want to just do the thing or solve the problem, we have to instill a direction of we need to track these things because we need to know where we're spending time and where our stability problems happen. Nothing is worse than somebody goes in and tries to fix something for person A by resetting a password on a user, and then you find out that some other application somewhere else used that same user and knew about the old password but doesn't know the new password. And this is where these tickets start helping us, because we can go back and we can go, okay, well, this is why this happened. What are we going to do with documentation, teaching, et cetera, to keep it from happening again? Now we're getting into the reliability side of DBRE, because we're thinking about this problem happened once. How are we going to prevent it from ever happening again? And how are we going to think about our systems and our tools in a way that not only are we stopping it from happening again, we're stopping similar patterns from happening again. And then similarly, everything when you get further along into DBRE and infrastructure as code and continuous deployment, continuous code checks, all these kinds of things, we get also into kind of the realm of what is a change? Like, if I go onto a database and I delete some 3 rows of duplicated data that got input into the system incorrectly, as a DBRE or a DBA, have I created a change? And I should go do a change request, whatever the change process is in my company, or have I not? That's something for you to think about, but it's a way of working that you do need to plan out. My ultimate goal for DBRE teams is nobody is going and running SQL on a machine directly. We are committing the code, we are testing the code in lower environments, yes, but then we are putting that into our continuous deployment system, and it's vetted stuff that the DBRE team has approved from whatever the SQL file does. Some companies are more advanced in this, and they'll do schema as code, and it'll automatically add columns to databases and call ghost and all of these types of things. Other people are more basic, and it's just sending a whole bunch of stored procedures through unit testing, making sure they're stable, deploying them onto a machine, making sure that works, and then when you go to deploy to production, you deploy the application, it deploys the schema stuff, the schema changes at the same time, and the SREs and the DBREs are there in case it goes sideways, not to do 50 individual tasks the night of the change. And then the other way of working that I think everybody should take to heart is always ask yourself, as we're moving to DBRE or as we're doing stuff as DBREs, what we're doing in task X, how are we making the system better? How are we making the lives for our users better? If we're not, we should ask ourselves why we're doing it that way or why we're doing it at all. And so I kind of talked on a lot of this already, but partnering with other teams, and I know there's a lot of text here, but I did that. If you've not been to Percona Live before, I did that because all of the slides go up on the website, and it's way more useful to people that didn't get to attend to be able to read this, or for you to go back and you to reflect on some of this. But what I said here is it's not enough to kind of say, oh, we're developer, infrastructure, and database, and say we're SRE, DevOps, or product team, or whatnot. You can't just jam those people together. It doesn't work. You have to really build those relationships up. We have to have people that want to be there and helping each other and aren't being pulled in different directions from their own organizations. And so I think this is where it can be a challenge sometimes, because we have to always remember the development team might want to do something because it makes sense to them, but they're not realizing the complications it's creating at some other layer of the stack, whether that be the database or an application. They don't understand it, or we don't understand, where we're like, well, it's just this is the way you should structure this table. It's that simple. And we don't understand the libraries that they're using and how that creates a modeling problem maybe in their application code. And so it's all about us talking to each other. And like I said earlier with the whole Java example, if I am asking the development team questions about how the database works and helping them understand how a B tree works or how different things work, and show them how it would have happened in their technology, then everybody's going to get along a lot better. And I used this quote here because I do like it. Discussions are always better than arguments, because an argument is to find out who is right, and a discussion is to find out what is right. And I really love that, because I can't even talk about the number of times that I've been in very long discussions, and it is just a battle of wills instead of just trying to figure out what the best solution is and picking that regardless of who came up with it. So then that takes us into focuses and goals. And this is kind of, what do we track, what do we ignore, what do we improve when it comes to the DBRE team. So core focuses of a DBRE team should be, we want to create a platform for the databases to where we're not afraid to go destroy a database and rebuild it. And that is extremely terrifying when you're first entering the concept of DBRE. But if we think about it, that all of that is saying is we want to trust our backups and our restore process enough that we will let somebody click button, run a thing that the DBRE team has vetted to allow those databases to build. A good example in my personal experience on this is I came into the airline that I work for right now, and it took 3 weeks to build a new Oracle server. Through all of the automations and stuff like that the DBRE team's built over the last couple of years, it now takes 6 lines of code change in a Terraform repository in Bitbucket and an apply of a plan. And it will build a new database, all of its networking and stuff like that. It'll set it up. It'll do the initial data load, top to toe, usable database for the development team in 4 hours. And all you have to do is put in a single file with 6 lines of code in it, or 6 variables set to different things. And that whole process just does itself. Now, when I was working with the DBA team at the time, and that are now the DBRE team, they were very skeptical of this. They go, well, I can't automate that. That's how am I going to manage that? How am I going to trust that it got done right? And what I had to really help them understand is the core focus of the DBRE team is to build the tools that allow that automation to happen. So it's not that the DBA or DBRE needs to go build and install the database process on the machine. It's that we've written the script to let code go do that. But we still own that script. We own bug fixing of said script. So we're not giving up control or management of that database. All we're doing is codifying what we did so that it's always done exactly the same way. And it doesn't matter, or it doesn't differ because I set it up. Oops. It doesn't differ because I personally set it up and I don't know, used all uppercase in the DB name in Oracle. Or not, I used an underscore in the DB name in Oracle, and somebody else doesn't use an underscore. You know, simple little changes like that that can add confusion to people is one of the things. The other thing is our focus should be eliminating gatekeeping. And to one of the big selling points when I was doing and getting DBRE teams to kick off with different business leaders is helping them understand that the real focus of DBRE is for us to, as a DBA team, to quit blocking users' access or blocking people's visibility into the database system and be much more transparent. And to this, a DBA or a DBRE shouldn't need to go in and add a user to a table. What we should do is we should be creating the tooling that would allow a manager who's hired somebody new to add their user, their new employee, to be able to access some dashboard or report that they need. And so that they can manage it themselves. At the end of the day, the DBA team and DBRE teams should not be user management teams. We should be database teams. And so that's where some of this is coming from. Let's let other teams manage governance, and let's us manage the database content itself. And then another focus on that is just mentoring other teams, internal or external to your organization, so that you're really sharing that knowledge. And then now, instead of people going, the DBA team or the DBRE team is blocking us, they're going, I talked to Bob over in the DBRE team, and we agreed that we think this is the solution forward for this problem. And then, again, practice the philosophy that anybody can suggest a change, but the DBRE team owns their Git repositories. The DBRE team would approve pull requests. A developer can make a recommendation. Maybe we've written code badly in some tool that we're doing as the DBRE team. Somebody else in the SRE team suggests an improvement. DBRE team still needs to own accepting that improvement. Backups are another good one that I always like to talk about. It's always very challenging with those. But back to the first point, we shouldn't be afraid to rebuild environments. But that means we have to be solid in our backups, and we have to trust our backups, and we need to have some test environments where we've pulled the rug out from under the database and see what happens, and is our code working the way it should be. The only thing I can say is embrace that chaos. Please embrace that chaos. Your team will be better for it by going through that. SLOs will drive you on what to fix and when to fix it. But make sure that as we're maturing this team, I know I was guilty of it as a DBA, and I know other people have been. Don't let your team still focus on, well, the app did this, or the database did that, or Jay ran this code and it broke my database because he dropped this index. Let's be blameless. Let's find the solutions to the problems, and let's call out what happened, but not who happened, is what I would say there. And then the last focus for the DBRE team, I would say to you, is we need to be protective of the data that's in our databases, but we need to not hoard the data. So we need to not hide away certain data or how it works or how these different schemas connect to each other. I've come into different organizations, and there's not a single ERD that exists outside of the DBA team or the DBRE team. That shouldn't happen. Like, how are they writing applications without knowing what the data model is? I've never understood that type of scenario. The other thing is, don't set goals for your DBRE members or yourself if you are a DBRE member for just you. Try to think of them as team goals, and then add personal goals to that. And then cascade those SMART goals to those people. I see a lot of things when people are shifting to DBRE teams, they try to go the other way because Bob is in charge of this area of the database stack. So all of his goals are about that area of the database stack. And instead, those should be team goals, and then it should be Bob delivered on these different team goals we had. I'm running a little low on time, so I'm going to kind of speed through the next part. And that's it. Really, it's promote a culture where you want people to make mistakes because people are learning from mistakes. And we've created systems of controlling said mistakes. And that perfect is the enemy of good. It really is. And so I want to focus on that. And then lastly, a DBRE general goal should be never try to get rid of all on-call pages. That's an unachievable thing. Or you've gotten rid of all of your on-call pages as the DBRE team because you've turned off alerts that shouldn't be turned off. You do want to minimize them. And what I do, for example, a good example of this would be Oracle and disk space. So if I have an Oracle server and it's running low on disk space, I'm in Amazon. I want an alarm to come through, and I want that alarm to automatically trigger an AWS Lambda that will grow the file system. That Lambda will then log into the database and say, okay, file system's now bigger. Which table space needed more space? Let me do that for you. And then that would raise like a ticket saying, hey, I did this thing. Now, doesn't need to wake up your on-call because the system healed itself. However, if you have more than X of these events in a time period, let's say more than 3 of these events in a 12-hour period, probably want to page somebody because, or if we're using 300% of the disk space we used yesterday, we probably want to page somebody there because while the automated system can heal for it, those automated systems shouldn't be allowed to completely run and go crazy, or all of a sudden you as the DBA or DBRE team is going to have a much bigger mess to clean up. Because now you're going to have 1,000 table space files that you have to clean up and merge, or all sorts of problems like that. The last part, actually no, this is next last part. This is on reporting versus privacy. And so I tried to create some simple rules in my view. Mileage will vary. Take what you need, change what you need. These aren't hard laws. Yes, DBRE and SRE and DevOps teams need to run with least privilege. And yes, that's going to be hard to do. And so we're going to have teams, and for some amount of time, especially DBRE teams, are going to still have full grant privileges on whatever database tech we're talking about. But eventually, what you want to do is have your DBRE team have a normal login as a normal user, and then they can ask the system via some tooling you have on the system, or a stored procedure, or a Jenkins job, whatever you do, for an elevated privilege that would then grant them those extra rights. And this isn't because I want to stop the DBRE team from operating fast. This is because if a DBRE's credentials got stolen, in the current design in most companies, that's a really bad day for everybody. Because that is really wide access to every data system. By going with this model that it takes time to get to, you prohibit that from happening, and you really are setting yourself up for success. But you shouldn't hide away metrics like CPU load, queries per second, data growth. How many times did we change a schema, and when did we make those schema changes? All of this stuff should be metrics and stuff. If you're in AWS, should be in CloudWatch. Anybody with access to your AWS account and CloudWatch access should be able to look at these dashboards and create dashboards that combine your metrics with their metrics to understand this stuff. That said, CloudWatch. If you're using CloudWatch and you're parsing your database logs, you probably don't want to share that with other people. You probably want to keep that one hidden unless you've done a really good job of scrubbing your logs from having query content in it. And if you did do that, how useful is that log? Decisions for your company to make individually. DBREs do build tools to allow people to access parts of the data or automate recovery of access. One thing that I'm building right now is a system where if somebody hits a locked user or a disabled user in some way, they'll be able to go through a Jenkins process to get that user reset, update the secret in AWS, and then it would, depending on what you changed, it would notify the correct applications that they needed to be restarted or not restarted based on said change. So I'm working on stuff like that. We should be building systems like that as DBREs. And again, I spend a lot of time here talking about communication. DBREs need to discuss and mentor other teams. But we should just be advising on why something is dangerous or special because it's PII or something like that. I urge you not to have your DBRE team become the governance team for privacy data. Because then you're going to get mired in politics and fights over why somebody thinks they're important and needs this data, and you don't want your team busy on having to deal with stuff that quite rightly belongs to the data protection officer. The last kind of area there is DBREs, and this took me a while to get in my head too. We don't own the data. We own the system and the management of the system and the operating of the system. But the data, we don't own the control, the access to it. The business owns their data. And we have to unteach some things that we might have had in our heads around the DBA team owns the data, they're responsible for the data. Yes, the DBRE team is responsible for the data and the ability of the data to be accessed. But the data content itself belongs to whoever needed that data. And this is a really good understanding, less specific in the United States, but when you start talking about Europe and other overseas partners, that distinction becomes really important because of the privacy laws that exist. And lastly, that DBREs are the enforcers of privacy rules, not the deciders of whether or not something should or shouldn't be done. So the last thing that I want to do, I think I just have just enough time for it, is the DBRE models that I had talked about earlier. So what you see here is we have kind of 1 through 5 here, and this is through like a maturity. And you can see that there's basically 3 zones. You have kind of your starting zone, which is red, is your central DBA team, DBRE team. And so that is DBRE team for all things. Then eventually you go into product aligned or infrastructure aligned or project aligned kind of models where you try to specialize it more because obviously being everything for everybody doesn't scale. But then you realize that each of those have their problems. And so you need to create a tiered approach. Oh, I thought I had another slide on that. But basically, I'll talk on this a bit more. So a central DBRE team would be one where you build a platform. All the databases are built through that. So like a good example is I'm using Oracle here. I know this is open source conference, but I'm using Oracle here because Oracle's database creation assistant tooling that they have can take a template file and it can apply that to build a database. And then so you can just have all these different template files in their system. They have a really good tool for this. Well, in a DBRE central team, you would build a platform with one AMI, say in AWS, and then all you would do is set a tag on that instance that it is going to be database, we'll call it the finance database, or we'll call it the web database. And that would tell it which template to build when it does all of the automations. And that's good for that kind of team, and that makes sense in a central way. But then what you end up with over time is you have a product team that wants to build a new feature, and they want to move fast. And to your question earlier about team structures and stuff like that, this is where you might embed a DBRE member into, say, product team to help write the new SQL, optimize the code to get that release out the door for that new feature. Infrastructure aligned is similar to that, except this is, well, what about projects such as patching or other regular maintenances and stuff like that, or platform improvements because we want to change the type of disk we use in Amazon from GP2 to GP3 or IO2 or whatnot. These are all infrastructure kind of alignments, and so what you would have a tendency to do is plunk a whole group of people over into that infrastructure aligned group, and then another group into your product team, and then maybe another one into the project one. But all you're going to do is create silos, and your DBRE team is going to have 3 different ways of doing things based on who was where, and it's going to become unmanaged, which is exactly what we're trying to get away from. The tiered approach is more of, if we assumed anything, that your infrastructure aligned / central DBRE team kind of concept is the infrastructure team. So we're responsible for a platform, we're responsible for patching, all those kind of central things. And then we loan out members for a temporary period of time to support whatever the business initiative for a certain project is. When you do this, it's called the tiered approach model. And when you do this, what is really the most critical thing is, let's say that you have product-centric delivery teams, and so you have a team that focuses on payments for your company. So all credit card processing, payment reconciliation, all that kind of fun stuff. The DBRE that gets assigned to help with that should be assigned for a very temporary basis, and then somebody else should be applied the next quarter, next week, the next project, however that gets structured out. You need to flip people out. Otherwise, that person or those couple people that are assigned to that are going to have their stuff they're doing, and the rest of the team's going to be over here, and you're going to lose that connectivity. But as long as you're forcing that rotation in and out from your team, you're sharing the knowledge in the team, which is always a good thing, but also you're making sure that any deviations from the broader plan are found and fixed on a more regular basis. And that was it for me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything. All right.